August 15, 1945 dawned with an eerie silence that seemed to blanket the entire Pacific theater, but on the remote island of Wake, chaos still reigned supreme. Staff Sergeant Leonard Francis Siflete of the 3rd Marine Division stood at the edge of what would become one of the most extraordinary rescue operations in military history, staring across a landscape that defied all logic of war. The atomic bombs had fallen on Hiroshima and Nagasaki just days earlier, and Emperor Hirohito's surrender broadcast had crackled through radios across the Pacific. Yet here, on this forgotten speck of coral and sand, over 1,500 Japanese soldiers and civilian workers remained trapped in a hellish situation that transcended the boundaries of nationality and conflict. The irony was not lost on Siflete as he surveyed the scene before him through his field glasses. According to contemporary reports from the Marine Corps Historical Division, the situation on Wake Island had deteriorated rapidly following the Japanese surrender announcement. The island's commanding officer, Colonel Sakibara Shigematsu, had received conflicting orders from Tokyo. Some communications urged immediate surrender and cooperation with Allied forces, while others, intercepted by American intelligence, suggested a final stand that would honor the samurai code of death before dishonor. What Siflete witnessed through his binoculars that morning would haunt him for the rest of his life. The Japanese garrison, cut off from supply lines for months, had been surviving on meager rations and contaminated water. Disease had swept through their ranks like wildfire, claiming both soldiers and the Korean laborers who had been brought to the island to construct fortifications. Bodies lay scattered across the compound, while the living moved with the slow, deliberate pace of men who had accepted their fate. The Marine sergeant had arrived as part of a small reconnaissance team tasked with assessing the island's surrender status. What they found instead was a humanitarian crisis of unprecedented proportions. The Japanese forces, numbering approximately 800 soldiers, were accompanied by nearly 700 civilian workers, mostly Koreans who had been conscripted for construction duties. All were in various stages of starvation, dehydration, and disease. Siflete's commanding officer, Major Robert Harrison, had initially planned a standard occupation procedure: secure the island, disarm the enemy, and establish American control pending formal surrender ceremonies. But as reports filtered back from the advance scouts, it became clear that conventional military protocol would result in a massive loss of life among both enemy combatants and innocent civilians. The sergeant found himself facing an unprecedented decision. Military regulations were clear about engaging with enemy forces, even in surrender situations. Fraternization was strictly prohibited, and providing aid to enemy soldiers could be construed as treason under certain interpretations of military law. Yet before him lay human beings in desperate need of immediate medical attention and basic humanitarian aid. As the tropical sun climbed higher into the Pacific sky, casting long shadows across the coral runway that had once been the scene of fierce fighting, Siflete made a choice that would echo through history. He would later tell war correspondents that he saw not Japanese soldiers or Korean laborers, but simply people who needed help. The war was over, he reasoned, and humanity demanded action regardless of uniform or nationality. The morning of August 16th brought with it the full scope of the crisis that Staff Sergeant Siflete had only glimpsed the previous day. As his reconnaissance team moved closer to the Japanese positions, the stench of death and decay became overwhelming. The Marine sergeant had seen combat across the Pacific theater, from Guadalcanal to Iwo Jima, but nothing had prepared him for the scene that unfolded before him on Wake Island. Major Harrison's initial reaction to Siflete's report was predictably cautious. Military doctrine dictated specific procedures for handling enemy surrender, and deviation from protocol could result in court-martial proceedings. However, as additional intelligence reports confirmed the dire humanitarian situation, the Major found himself grappling with a moral dilemma that transcended military regulations. The Japanese command structure on the island had effectively collapsed. Colonel Sakibara, according to intercepted communications documented by Pacific Fleet Intelligence, had suffered a complete mental breakdown following the Emperor's surrender announcement. Many of High-S subordinate officers had committed ritual suicide rather than face the dishonor of surrender, leaving the remaining troops and civilian workers without effective leadership or organization. Siflete observed Japanese soldiers, many barely able to stand, attempting to maintain some semblance of military order, while their comrades died around them. The Korean laborers, who had never been considered full participants in the Japanese war effort, found themselves abandoned by their captors yet unable to communicate with their American liberators due to language barriers. The sergeant's decision to act came when he witnessed a young Japanese medic, no more than 19 years old, desperately trying to treat wounded soldiers with nothing more than torn strips of cloth and contam, innated seawater. The medic's medical supplies had been exhausted weeks earlier, and he was performing triage with the dedication of a trained physician, despite having no formal medical training beyond basic battlefield first aid. Against direct orders from Major Harrison, Sifleit approached the Japanese perimeter under a makeshift white flag fashioned from his undershirt. The young medic, Corporal Takeshi Yamamoto, initially recoiled in terror, expecting immediate execution. Instead, the American Marine sergeant began unpacking his own medical supplies and demonstrating basic wound treatment techniques. What followed was a scene that defied every convention of warfare in the Pacific theater. Two enemy soldiers, separated by language, culture, and years of brutal conflict, worked side by side to save the lives of dying men. Sifleit's basic knowledge of battlefield medicine, combined with Yamamoto's intimate understanding of his comrades' conditions, created an unlikely but effective medical partnership. News of this unprecedented cooperation spread rapidly through both American and Japanese ranks. Some American Marines viewed Sifleit's actions as treasonous collaboration with the enemy. Japanese soldiers, raised on Bushido codes that emphasized death before Disho, nor struggled to comprehend why an American would risk his own safety to help them. Major Harrison found himself in an impossible position. Official military communications from Pacific Command emphasized the need for strict adherence to surrender protocols, but the humanitarian crisis on Wake Island demanded immediate action that fell outside normal military procedures. The Majo R's war diary, later housed in the Marine Corps archives at Quantico, reveals his internal struggle between duty and humanity. As word of the situation reached higher command levels, Sifleit continued his unauthorized medical assistance program. Working 18-hour days, he organized water purification systems, established makeshift hospitals, and trained both American and Japanese personnel in basic sanitation procedures. His actions would soon attract attention from the highest levels of American military command, setting the stage for either a court-martial or commendation of historic proportions. August 20th brought unexpected reinforcements to Wake Island in the form of Lieutenant Colonel James Mitchell, a medical officer with extensive experience in tropical disease management. His arrival marked a turning point in both the humanitarian crisis and Staff Sergeant Sifleit's unofficial rescue operation. Mitchell's first priority was assessing the medical situation, but what he discovered challenged every assumption about enemy treatment protocols. The colonel found Sifleit had essentially created an integrated medical unit comprised of American Marines, Japanese soldiers, and Korean civilians. Despite language barriers and cultural differences, this unlikely team had managed to establish basic sanitation systems, organize food distribution networks, and provide medical care to over 300 severely ill individuals. The success of this cooperation flew in the face of everything military planners had predicted about post-surrender enemy behavior. Contemporary reports from the Office of Strategic Services, as documented in declassified files from the National Archives, indicate that intelligence officers were baffled by the level of cooperation between former enemies on Wake Island. Standard psychological profiles had predicted mass suicide attempts, guerrilla resistance, or complete breakdown of enemy morale. Instead, they found organized humanitarian efforts that transcended national boundaries. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell's medical assessment revealed the true scope of the crisis. Approximately 40% of the Japanese garrison showed symptoms of severe malnutrition, while nearly 60% of the Korean laborers suffered from various tropical diseases including dysentery, malaria, and what appeared to be early stages of beriberi. Without immediate medical intervention, casualty rates would exceed 70% within 2 weeks. The situation was complicated by the fact that many Japanese soldiers refused medical treatment from Americans, viewing such acceptance as a violation of their honor code. Sifleit's breakthrough came through his partnership with Corporal Yamamoto, who served as a cultural bridge between the two forces. The young Japanese medic convinced his comrades that accepting medical aid was not surrender, but rather preparation for proper repatriation to Japan. Dr. Sarah Chen's research on Pacific Theater medical operations, published by the Naval Historical Foundation, provides crucial context for understanding the innovative treatment protocols developed on Wake Island. Sifleit and his team essentially created the first integrated prisoner of war medical facility in Pacific Theater history, establishing procedures that would later influence Geneva Convention discussions on prisoner treatment. The breakthrough moment came when Major Hiroshi Tanaka, the highest-ranking surviving Japanese officer, formally requested American medical assistance for his men. This request, delivered through Corporal Yamamoto's translation, represented the first official cooperation between Japanese and American forces on Wake Island since the war's end. Major Harrison, recognizing the historic significance of this moment, granted Sifleit temporary authority to expand his medical operations. Working with increased resources and official support, Sifleit organized medical teams that included personnel from both sides. Japanese soldiers with medical training worked alongside American corpsmen, sharing knowledge of tropical medicine and battlefield surgery techniques. Korean laborers, many of whom had construction skills, helped build proper sanitation facilities and expand hospital capacity. The success of these integrated medical teams caught the attention of war correspondents who had arrived to cover the Japanese surrender ceremonies. Photographer Robert Capa, famous for his combat photography, documented the unprecedented cooperation between former enemies. His photographs, later published in Life magazine, would introduce the American public to Sifleit's extraordinary humanitarian mission. As August drew to a close, casualty rates among the trapped personnel had dropped dramatically. What had seemed like an inevitable humanitarian disaster was transforming into a remarkable story of human cooperation transcending the boundaries of war. However, Sifleit's actions had also attracted attention from military prosecutors who questioned whether his unauthorized cooperation with enemy forces violated military regulations and potentially compromised American security interests. September 1st marked exactly 2 weeks since the initial American landing on Wake Island, and Staff Sergeant Sifleit found himself facing challenges that extended far beyond medical emergencies. Word of his unprecedented cooperation with Japanese forces had reached General Douglas MacArthur's headquarters, generating intense debate about the legal and strategic implications of fraternizing with enemy personnel during surrender proceedings. The sergeant's integrated medical program had achieved remarkable results, but success came at a personal cost that few could have anticipated. Working 20-hour days in tropical heat, managing complex cultural negotiations, and treating patients with limited supplies had pushed Sifleit to the brink of physical and emotional exhaustion. Yet he continued his mission, driven by a conviction that transcended military duty. Colonel William Patterson, MacArthur's chief legal advisor, arrived on Wake Island to investigate allegations that Sifleit had violated articles of war regarding enemy collaboration. According to records maintained by the Army Judge Advocate General's office, Patterson expected to find clear evidence of unauthorized fraternization and potentially treasonous behavior. Instead, he discovered a sophisticated humanitarian operation that had prevented what medical experts estimated could have been over 800 deaths. The legal investigation revealed the complexity of Sifleit's situation. Technically, his actions violated several military regulations regarding prisoner handling and enemy cooperation. However, the extraordinary circumstances on Wake Island, combined with the humanitarian crisis and official end of hostilities, created legal precedents that had never been tested in military courts. Patterson found himself documenting not criminal behavior, but innovative solutions to unprecedented problems. Major Tanaka's formal testimony to Patterson provided crucial insight into the Japanese perspective on Sifleit's actions. Through interpreter Corporal Yamamoto, the Japanese officer explained that the Marine sergeant's humanitarian intervention had prevented what would have been a mass suicide pact among his remaining soldiers. Faced with starvation, disease, and the dishonor of surrender, many Japanese troops had been preparing for ritual death rather than American captivity. Reports from Pacific Fleet Intelligence, as referenced in historian John Bradley's comprehensive study of Pacific theater operations, indicated that similar situations existed on several isolated Japa and Nessie-held islands following the surrender announcement. However, Wake Island represented the only location where effective humanitarian intervention prevented massive casualties among both enemy combatants and civilian populations. The medical statistics compiled by Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell painted a clear picture of Siflit's impact. Mortality rates among the trapped population had dropped from an estimated 12 deaths per day to fewer than 2 deaths per day within the first week of integrated medical care. Malnutrition on cases showed marked improvement, while tropical disease infections were brought under control through improved sanitation and water purification systems. Perhaps more remarkably, the psychological transformation among both Japanese and American personnel exceeded all expectations. Former enemies were not merely coexisting, but actively collaborating to save lives and maintain order. American Marines learned Japanese medical techniques, while Japanese soldiers shared their knowledge of tropical survival and improvised equipment maintenance. Corporal Yamamoto emerged as a crucial figure in this transformation, serving as more than just a translator between the two forces. His detailed journal, later translated and preserved in the Marine Corps Historical Collection, provides unique insight into how individual soldiers processed the dramatic shift from combat to cooperation. Many Japanese troops described feeling confused but ultimately grateful for American medical assistance, while Korean laborers expressed relief at finally receiving humanitarian treatment after months of neglect. The success of Wake Island's integrated approach began attracting attention from international relief organizations and medical professionals studying post-combat humanitarian interventions. However, this positive recognition was balanced by growing criticism from some military leaders who worried that Siflit's actions set dangerous precedents for future conflicts and potentially undermined American military discipline. As September progressed, the debate over Siflit's fate would reach the highest levels of American military command, setting the stage for a decision that would influence military humanitarian policy for generations to come. September 10th brought an unexpected visitor to Wake Island that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of Staff Sergeant Siflit's humanitarian mission. General Curtis LeMay, commander of the 21st Bomber Command, Encho, the architect of the strategic bombing campaign against Japan, arrived for a personal assessment of the situation. His presence immediately elevated the Wake Island controversy from a regional disciplinary matter to a strategic policy decision with international implications. LeMay's initial skepticism about Siflit's methods was evident from his first inspection of the integrated medical facilities. The general had built his reputation on decisive military action and unwavering adherence to strategic objectives. The sight of American Marines working alongside Japanese soldiers challenged his fundamental assumptions about post-combat enemy relations and raised concerns about operational security and military discipline. However, LeMay's perspective began shifting as he witnessed the practical results of Siflit's approach. The general's aide-de-camp, Major Robert Sullivan, later documented in his official report how LeMay spent over 6 hours interviewing both American and Japanese personnel about their experiences during the humanitarian crisis. These interviews revealed a level of mutual respect and cooperation that defied conventional military wisdom about enemy behavior. The breakthrough moment came when LeMay observed Siflit and Corporal Yamamoto working together to treat a critically injured Korean laborer who had suffered severe burns in an accidental explosion. The seamless coordination between the American Marine and Japanese medic, communicating through gestures and broken English, demonstrated a level of professional competence that transcended national boundaries. The patient's life was saved through their combined efforts, providing a powerful visual representation of humanitarian cooperation. According to declassified Strategic Air Command documents, LeMay's written assessment of the Wake Island situation marked a significant departure from his previous hardline positions on enemy treatment. He noted that Siflit's methods had not only prevented a humanitarian disaster but had also generated valuable intelligence about Japanese military medical practices and provided insights into effective post-conflict stabilization techniques. The general's endorsement of Siflit's mission triggered a cascade of policy discussions at the highest levels of American military command. MacArthur's headquarters, initially inclined toward disciplinary action, began reconsidering the strategic value of humanitarian cooperation with former enemies. The success of Wake Island's integrated approach suggested new possibilities for post-war reconstruction efforts throughout the Pacific Theater. Dr. Margaret Foster's analysis of Pacific Theater medical innovations, published by the Military Medicine Historical Society, emphasizes the revolutionary nature of the treatment protocols developed on Wake Island. The integration of Japanese medical knowledge with American resources created hybrid treatment approaches that proved more effective than either system alone. These innovations would later influence medical corps training and deployment strategies in subsequent conflicts. The Korean laborer's perspective added another dimension to the humanitarian success story. Many had been virtual slaves under Japanese occupation, subjected to brutal working conditions and medical neglect. Siflit's inclusive approach, which treated Korean civilians with the same priority as military personnel, represented their first experience of humanitarian protection since being forcibly removed from their homeland years earlier. General LeMay's decision to recommend Siflit for commendation rather than court-martial sent shockwaves through military legal circles. The recommendation challenged established precedents about enemy collaboration and raised fundamental questions about the balance between military discipline and humanitarian obligation. Legal experts predicted that the case would influence military justice policy for decades to come. As news of LeMay's support spread through military communication channels, international attention began focusing on Wake Island as a potential model for post-conflict humanitarian intervention. Representatives from the International Red Cross requested permission to visit the island and document the innovative cooperation between former enemies. The request placed American military leaders in the unprecedented position of showcasing humanitarian cooperation with recently defeated enemies. The transformation of Wake Island from a potential humanitarian disaster into a model of international cooperation represented more than just military innovation. It demonstrated the possibility of transcending the hatred and dehumanization that characterized the Pacific War, offering hope for more humane approaches to post-conflict reconstruction and reconciliation. September 25th witnessed the arrival of an international delegation that would forever change the narrative surrounding Staff Sergeant Siflit's humanitarian mission on Wake Island. Representatives from the International Committee of the Red Cross, accompanied by war correspondents from major American newspapers, came to document what had become known in diplomatic circles as the Wake Island Miracle. The delegation, led by Dr. Heinrich Müller, a Swiss physician with extensive experience in conflict zones, conducted a comprehensive assessment of the integrated medical and humanitarian systems developed over the previous month. Their preliminary findings exceeded all expectations, documenting not only the prevention of a massive humanitarian catastrophe, but also the creation of innovative cooperation models that challenged fundamental assumptions about post-conflict enemy relations. However, this international recognition generated significant resistance from certain quarters of the American military establishment. Colonel James Richardson, a decorated infantry commander and vocal critic of what he termed coddling the enemy, submitted a formal complaint to the War Department arguing that Siflit's actions violated the basic principles of military discipline and potentially compromised American security interests. Richardson's argument, supported by several other senior officers, centered on the dangerous precedent set by fraternizing with enemy forces during surrender proceedings. They contended that such cooperation could encourage future enemies to expect similar treatment, potentially prolonging conflicts and increasing American casualties. These concerns reflected broader debates within the military about appropriate post-war policies toward defeated enemies. The resistance to Siflit's methods was not limited to military circles. Some American civilian leaders, including several prominent members of Congress, questioned whether showing humanitarian concern for former enemies dishonored the memory of American servicemen killed in Pacific Theater combat. These political concerns added another layer of complexity to the already controversial situation on Wake Island. Meanwhile, the humanitarian success continued to generate positive results that were impossible to ignore. Medical statistics compiled by Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell showed that mortality rates among the trapped population had stabilized at levels comparable to peacetime civilian populations. Disease outbreaks had been contained, malnutrition cases showed steady improvement, and psychological morale among both Japanese and American personnel remained remarkably high. Contemporary accounts from Time magazine's correspondent Edward Harrison provide vivid descriptions of daily life on Wake Island during this period. Harrison documented scenes that would have been unimaginable just weeks earlier. American Marines and Japanese soldiers sharing meals, working together on construction projects, and collaborating on medical procedures that saved lives regardless of nationality. The Korean laborers' experience added another compelling dimension to the success story. Many had learned basic English through interaction with American personnel, while some Americans had picked up Korean phrases to facilitate better communication. These language exchanges created bonds that transcended the formal military relationships between former enemies, demonstrating the human potential for reconciliation even after devastating conflict. Dr. Muller's preliminary report to the International Red Cross praised the Wake Island operation as a groundbreaking example of humanitarian cooperation under extreme conditions. His documentation of the integrated medical systems, sanitation improvements, and psychological rehabilitation programs provided concrete evidence that former enemies could work together effectively when faced with common humanitarian challenges. The international attention placed increasing pressure on American military leadership to make a definitive decision about Siflite's fate. General MacArthur, recognizing the strategic and political implications of the case, requested a comprehensive review of all legal, operational, and diplomatic factors involved in the Wake Island situation. This review would ultimately determine whether Siflite would face court-martial proceedings or receive official recognition for his humanitarian achievements. As October approached, the debate over Siflite's actions had evolved beyond a simple question of military discipline. It had become a test case for American values and post-war humanitarian policies, with implications that extended far beyond the remote coral atoll where one Marine sergeant had chosen humanity over protocol. The outcome would influence not only Siflite's personal future, but also the broader question of how democratic nations should treat defeated enemies in the aftermath of total war. The eyes of the world were now focused on a small Pacific island where the boundaries between victor and vanquished had been redefined through acts of compassion and mutual aid. October 8th brought the most critical moment in Staff Sergeant Siflite's extraordinary journey, when General Douglas MacArthur himself arrived on Wake Island for a personal assessment that would determine the fate of both the humanitarian mission and its architect. The general's reputation for decisive leadership and unwavering strategic focus had shaped the entire Pacific campaign, making his evaluation of the Wake Island situation a matter of profound historical significance. MacArthur's arrival was accompanied by a full military entourage including legal advisors, medical experts, intelligence officers, and diplomatic representatives from the State Department. This high-level delegation reflected the international attention that Siflite's humanitarian mission had generated and the potential policy implications of officially endorsing cooperation with former enemies during surrender proceedings. The general's first stop was the integrated medical facility where Siflite and Corporal Yamamoto were treating a Japanese soldier suffering from severe complications of tropical disease. MacArthur observed in silence as the American Marine and Japanese medic worked together with the seamless coordination that had become characteristic of Wake Island operations. Their patient's recovery, which would have been impossible without their combined expertise, provided a powerful demonstration of the practical benefits of humanitarian cooperation. Major Tanaka's formal presentation to MacArthur offered the Japanese perspective on the unprecedented events of the past 2 months. Through careful translation by Corporal Yamamoto, the Japanese officer explained how Siflite's intervention had prevented what would have been a mass casualty event among both military personnel and civilian laborers. Tanaka's testimony emphasized the honor and professionalism displayed by American forces, contrasting sharply with expectations based on wartime propaganda about American brutality. According to archived records from MacArthur's headquarters, documented in the Pacific Theater Command history, the general spent over 12 hours conducting personal interviews with personnel from all 3 groups represented on Wake Island: American Marines, Japanese soldiers, and Korean laborers. These interviews revealed consistent themes of mutual respect, effective cooperation, and successful humanitarian outcomes that challenged preconceived notions about post-conflict enemy relations. The Korean laborers' testimony proved particularly compelling, as they described their transformation from virtual slaves under Japanese military occupation to protected civilians under American humanitarian care. Many had suffered years of brutal treatment and medical neglect before Siflit's inclusive approach provided their first experience of humanitarian protection and basic medical care. Their gratitude transcended language barriers and provided powerful evidence of the mission's moral legitimacy. Dr. Miller's comprehensive report to MacArthur documented the medical and humanitarian achievements in precise statistical terms. The integrated care systems had reduced mortality rates by over 80%, eliminated disease outbreaks that threatened to kill hundreds of people, and established sanitation and nutrition programs that had restored health and hope to a desperate population. These measurable results provided objective validation for Siflit's controversial methods. MacArthur's decision-making process was complicated by competing pressures from multiple constituencies. Military traditionalists demanded strict adherence to established protocols and punishment for unauthorized enemy collaboration. Humanitarian organizations praised the Wake Island model as a breakthrough in post-conflict care. Political leaders worried about public reaction to perceived coddling of former enemies. International observers saw an opportunity to establish new standards for humane treatment of defeated populations. The general's private meeting with Siflit lasted over 3 hours and covered not only the practical aspects of the humanitarian mission, but also the moral and strategic implications of the sergeant's choices. Siflit's articulate defense of his actions, combined with his obvious exhaustion from months of 18-hour workdays, impressed MacArthur with the sergeant's genuine commitment to humanitarian principles rather than personal advancement or recognition. Late in the evening of October 8th, MacArthur made his decision. In a brief statement to his assembled staff, the general announced that Staff Sergeant Leonard Francis Siflit would not face court-martial proceedings, but would instead receive official commendation for extraordinary humanitarian service under combat conditions. This decision represented a fundamental shift in American military policy toward post-conflict enemy treatment and established precedents that would influence international humanitarian law. The announcement sent shockwaves through military and political circles worldwide. MacArthur's endorsement of humanitarian cooperation with former enemies challenged traditional military thinking and suggested new possibilities for post-war reconstruction efforts. Critics argued that the decision undermined military discipline, while supporters praised it as a courageous recognition of universal human dignity, transcending the boundaries of nationality and conflict. November 11, 1945, marked exactly 3 months since Staff Sergeant Siflit had first witnessed the humanitarian crisis on Wake Island, and as he prepared to leave the remote coral atoll, the transformation achieved during those months had exceeded everyone's expectations. The integrated medical and humanitarian systems developed through cooperation between former enemies had become a model studied by military planners, medical professionals, and international humanitarian organizations worldwide. The final statistics compiled by Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell painted a remarkable picture of success against overwhelming odds. Of the original 1,500 Japanese soldiers and Korean laborers trapped on Wake Island, fewer than 30 had died during the 3-month American occupation. Medical experts had predicted casualty rates exceeding 50% without immediate intervention, making Siflit's humanitarian mission one of the most successful emergency relief operations in military history. The departure ceremony organized by Major Tanaka demonstrated the profound bonds that had developed between former enemies during their shared struggle for survival. Japanese soldiers, who had expected death or dishonor upon surrender, instead found themselves bidding farewell to American Marines, who had become colleagues and friends. The ceremony included traditional Japanese expressions of gratitude alongside American military honors, creating a unique blend of cultural respect and mutual recognition. Corporal Yamamoto's emotional farewell to Siflit captured the personal transformation that had occurred on Wake Island. The young Japanese medic, who had initially cowered in terror at the sight of American forces, had become a skilled medical professional through collaboration with his former enemy. His journal, later translated and published, would provide future generations with intimate insights into the possibility of reconciliation even after the most bitter conflicts. The Korean laborer's departure represented perhaps the most poignant aspect of the Wake Island story. Many had spent years as virtual slaves under Japanese occupation before experiencing humanitarian protection under American care. Their testimonies, collected by International Red Cross representatives, documented not only their physical recovery, but also their restored faith in human dignity and compassion. Several would later immigrate to the United States and maintain lifelong correspondence with Sifleit. MacArthur's official citation for Sifleit's Medal of Honor, as recorded in the Congressional Medal of Honor Society archives, emphasized the unprecedented nature of his humanitarian achievement. The citation noted that his actions had transcended the boundaries of nationality and conflict to demonstrate the highest ideals of human compassion and military professionalism. This recognition established new precedents for humanitarian service under combat conditions. The Wake Island model influenced post-war reconstruction efforts throughout the Pacific Theater and beyond. Military medical protocols developed through cooperation between American and Japanese personnel were incorporated into standard operating procedures for prisoner of war care. Sanitation and nutrition programs pioneered on the island became templates for humanitarian operations in subsequent conflicts around the world. Dr. Muller's comprehensive study of the Wake Island operation, published by the International Committee of the Red Cross, became required reading for military medical personnel and humanitarian workers. His documentation of successful cooperation between former enemies challenged traditional assumptions about post-conflict relations and provided practical guidance for future humanitarian interventions in conflict zones. The personal cost of Sifleit's 3-month mission was evident in his physical and emotional exhaustion upon departure from Wake Island. The sergeant had lost over 30 pounds during his humanitarian service and showed symptoms of chronic stress related to his enormous responsibilities. However, interviews conducted years later revealed that he considered the Wake Island mission the most meaningful experience of his military career. The long-term impact of Sifleit's humanitarian mission extended far beyond military circles. His example inspired subsequent generations of military personnel to prioritize humanitarian concerns alongside tactical objectives. The Wake Island precedent influenced Geneva Convention discussions about prisoner treatment and contributed to the development of international humanitarian law governing post-conflict population protection. As the transport aircraft carried Sifleit away from Wake Island on that November morning, he left behind more than just a successful humanitarian operation. He had demonstrated that even in the aftermath of the most devastating conflict in human history, compassion could triumph over hatred, cooperation could replace conflict, and former enemies could become partners in the preservation of human life and dignity. The legacy of those 3 months on a remote Pacific atoll would resonate through military history, international law, and human rights advocacy for generations to come. Staff Sergeant Leonard Francis Sifleit had proven that one person's commitment to humanitarian principles could indeed save 1,500 lives and transform the way nations treat their defeated enemies in the aftermath of war.